the quick note that this session is pre-recorded. So we're first going to have 10 minutes of video, and then we do the live Q&A session. Enjoy the video.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Leveraging FHIR Implementation Guides and Profiles. I'm going to be going through some real-world examples of how we're using implementation guides and profiles in the Google Cloud Healthcare API. So first, a quick note about me. My name is Nick Klassen. I'm a software developer at Google, and I work primarily on the Cloud Healthcare API, focusing on FHIR and HL7. So what is profiling for in general? The spec says a few things about it. The most important to us today is rules about which FHIR resource elements are or are not used, and what additional elements are added that are not part of the base specification. So this allows you to model your use cases with the general FHIR resources, but extend them either with extensions or restrict them with other rules. But from a server perspective, as an implementer of a FHIR server, we view these as a set of validation rules that should be performed on each FHIR resource. So I'll give you a quick example of what a profile might look like. This is taken from the US Core Implementation Guide, and this describes how to create a patient resource within the system. So you can see some green boxes here under patient. Those are extensions that have been defined, so that's extending the patient with a race field, an ethnicity, and a birth sex. And then you can also see some restrictions here. So identifiers are no longer allowed to be empty. Instead, one of them is required, and the same with a human name is required, whereas in the base spec it isn't. So what does Google want to do, and what do Google Cloud customers want to do with profiles? So we're focused on enabling implementation guide-driven use cases. Customers want to conform to a particular implementation guide, like you saw with US Core, and they want the Cloud FHIR store to help them do that. We've also been working on incorporating profiles into data mapping workflows. So this provides a greater assurance that your workflow is doing what you expect it to do, and that your data is consistent with what you expect. We also, the way that we do this is through continuous validation on resources. So every resource that comes into our FHIR stores is validated and rejected if it doesn't meet the criteria laid out by the profiles. And so how does this help customers? As I said, it gives them greater confidence that they are actually complying to the implementation guides they think they are. So this is especially helpful if you have third-party systems that are sending you data, or you're doing complicated mapping. If any one of those systems falls out of compliance, then you'll be alerted to that. It also can enable greater interoperability by automating the profile's meta field. So the meta field can represent or include what profiles our resource claims to conform to. So if you want your store to conform to US Core, you would need to specify this in every resource. Since we've checked that the resources conform to our understanding of the US Core profiles, we can just add that URL to the profile meta field and do that annotation for you. You can also just perform iteration on your profiles themselves, update a new version of your profiles, send in your test cases as resources, and see if they pass or fail. So how do I add profiles to my FHIR store? You start by downloading the implementation guide. Most implementation guides hosted under the hl7.org URLs have an easy way to download the entire package, so you can get all the conformance resources that are needed in one zip. The next step is to do something that is specific to the FHIR store's implementation, which is to augment the global field to specify which profiles are enforced as part of this implementation guide. The problem with the implementation guide resource when it is downloaded from one of these bundles is that it doesn't tell us what the main profiles are. So when you go to the web version, you'll see an HTML page that lists the profiles that are included. But when we look at the bundle, we can't necessarily assume that every structure definition we see in the bundle is part of the implementation guide and should be enforced. So we have created this system for defining which profile or which structure definitions you actually care about by using the global field. So this is just a standard FHIR field on the implementation guide, and the purpose is supposed to be to declare what profiles are in the implementation guide. So if other FHIR servers take up this convention, then this could be a standard way of pre-configuring what an implementation guide specifies should be enforced. But we're looking for feedback on this specifically. So once you've modified the implementation resource, you can upload them to your FHIR store. So we support our own custom import operation that can be used to load the resources, or you can use a standard batch or transaction bundle. So this needs to include everything required to enforce the implementation guide. So that's the implementation guide resource itself, so we know what resources types we're validating on, as well as structure definitions. Any value sets or code systems that you want enforced also need to be uploaded to the FHIR store in full. So right now we only support reading conformance resources from within your FHIR store, and we won't make external calls to try to resolve a particular value set or code system. So they need to be included in the bundle that you upload. So finally, we enable a particular implementation guide on the FHIR store. So this is our way of saying that the FHIR store should be in conformance to the profiles in this implementation guide. So once you set the enabled implementations guide in the validation config, all of the profiles in that implementation guide will be enforced. So that can be a little bit confusing. So we've created this flowchart that will demonstrate how we actually evaluate those. So adding a resource means coming through any of the standard FHIR operations that can create a resource. So this would be create, update, or patch, and then inside of a bundle or not. So when a resource is added to the FHIR store, we now ask, is validation enabled? If it's not, if you don't have that validation config field set on your FHIR store, or you've just disabled it through a different flag, we'll bypass all implementation guide rules. But if you do have validation enabled, then we go and check, can we actually find those implementation guides? Is everything configured correctly? So those implementation guides will give you one or more structure definitions that can be enforced for the incoming resource type. So the FHIR server will look for at least one structure definition the resource conforms to. If it doesn't match any of them, that's when the resource will be rejected. If it does match one of them, the resource will now be accepted, but we can do some additional work on that automation side to add even more profiles. So any resource or any profile that the resource conforms to will be added to the meta field. And then we'll also look at any profiles that were already in that meta field. So if a resource claims to conform to US Core, but US Core isn't enforced on this store, then we can still check the conformance, assuming a structure definition exists in the store. And if we get profiles that we don't know how to check the conformance to, we'll just ignore those because those aren't of concern to our system. So if you want to see a demo of all of this in action, you can check out our upcoming session, Google Cloud FHIR APIs, Data Ingestion Management and Analytics, being presented by Carin, and he will be walking through what the end-to-end workflow of the whole mapping and ingestion pipeline can look like, including profile validation. So I've included my contact information if you want to get a hold of me. And now we'll go to Q&A.
All right, thank you very much for your presentation. We don't yet have any questions. We're gonna need some time after the video finishes to come up with a question, post it, and then Nick or Dharmesh can answer it. But in the meantime, you had some material you wanted to show as well. Or Dharmesh had some material he wanted to show. Don't forget to unmute Dharmesh.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would like to share is we have a next session in another half an hour or so, which Nick mentioned, where myself and Kalyan or Marty will showcase the implementation of how the profiles can be imported and enabled on a Firestore, and how you can test your Fire resources against those profiles. So if you want to dive deeper or interested more in learning about how the implementation guides can be used with Google Cloud FHIR server, we have that session. That's all I wanted to say. But I'm here to answer any questions with Nick. So I'll wait for the questions.
Yeah, obviously it's also okay to unmute yourself and start talking. It doesn't have to be typed.
The one thing I can comment on a bit more is how we wanted to leverage the meta field and how that aids interoperability. It seems very important, at least in my opinion, that resources are actually annotated with the profiles that they conform to and they think that they conform to. And so we wanted to make that as easy as possible to not have to manage. So especially if you're getting resources coming in from different systems that don't know that you want the metadata field annotated. Say you have like a front end application that's issuing queries to your Firestore. It only wants US core patients, but you have patients coming in that might not be. I think that this is a really useful thing to pay attention to. And so if we can automate that for you by checking that it is actually a US core patient and adding that to your meta fields, then hopefully that's useful. I also mentioned in the presentation that our approach to using the global field of the implementation guide is still just our decision. I hope that if you are working on creating implementation guides or you're working on enforcing implementation guides, then you'll talk to us about if this makes sense, because if we all set it up the same way, then that's what interoperability is all about.
Right. Two questions came in. I guess you have them in front of you as well. You can choose whichever you want to answer first.
Yeah, so I was just talking about querying a FHIR profile. So the question is, can a profile be used to query specific items from a FHIR repo? That is possible. There is a standard search parameter that is defined on that field. So the path is like say patient or whatever resource .meta.profile. And so you can use the canonical URL of the profile that you'd like it to match. And it'll return the resource. If you don't have validation configured on your store, then anybody can set any profile in that field, and so it's not necessarily helpful. And so that's why it's important to have some sort of validation in your system to ensure that resources aren't making claims that aren't enforced. So there's another question here. How do you handle data that has been ingested in one profile and is queried requiring a different profile? So we don't remove profile annotations that we don't that we haven't enforced. So if you don't have a profile in your store, we won't remove that from the meta field. And so you can still query on that. And if you have multiple profiles configured as being validated on your store, any resource that matches any one of those profiles will get all of them annotated. So the flowchart I included in my slides is also in our documentation. We found that this can be a bit confusing to get your head around. So hopefully the flowchart that you saw will help with that.
Should I pull it up for a moment, or is it not necessary?
I think that's okay. It's kind of low resolution in the slides anyway, so
Oh,
better
okay.
to just check out our documentation on that.
Great. I guess the presentation was so clear that not a lot of questions can be asked. All right. If there are not any questions left, we might wrap it up. Obviously, questions can also be asked after the presentation has been finished. The Q&A part will still be open, so we'll wait for the questions. And thank you very much for presenting.
Yep, thanks everyone for coming. And if you want to see how all of this fits together, then come out to our session starting at 11 my time. So
Right, thank you.
thanks.